Some of you might have heard the saying, you never get a second chance at a first impression. It's all about making an impression on someone. But I really don't like that phrase, because really what it does is it puts all the pressure on the person who's making the impression. But in reality, if we're honest, most of the time when we have an impression of someone, it has as much to do with our own previous experiences and expectations, and not so much to do with the person who's probably just being themselves most of the time. The reality is, just like we have impressions of each other when we meet each other for the first time, most of us will have had some sort of impression about Jesus when we met him for the first time. Or maybe even now you're having some of those first impression moments with Jesus and what it means to be a Christian. And we see actually in the Bible that lots of people have these sort of first impression reactions to Jesus. Today we're looking at Luke chapter 7, verses 18 to 23. And in these verses we actually get a little bit of a glimpse of the impression that John the Baptist has about Jesus. What's happening in this passage is John the Baptist actually sends some of his disciples to Jesus. And he sends them with a question. The question is simple. He says, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" And Luke repeats this question twice, because I think it's a very key question that actually most of us at some point in our journey of faith, we learn things about Jesus, we learn things about who he is, and we come to the point of asking, like John the Baptist, are you for real? Are you really the one who was sent to rescue us? This is John's key question. And what we see in John's question, it reveals actually a lot about his impression of Jesus. You see, we can get a glimpse. If you want to look at it for yourself, you can look at Luke chapter 3, verses 16 to 20. And what we see there is what Luke's first impression of Jesus is on the basis of his expectations and his experience. You see, in Luke chapter 3, verses 16 to 20, those first few verses there, he's having the expectation that Jesus is going to come with a whole bunch of judgment, that he's going to do away with the sinners, that he's going to bring God's kingdom in, and it's very aggressive. I mean, John preached repentance. So I think he has this expectation that Jesus is going to come, and he's going to come very strong and very powerful, and he's going to deal with all the sinners. The other thing we see in Luke chapter 3, verses 16 to 20 is that John is asking his question out of a particular experience. At the very end there in verse 20, we're told that John is arrested by Herod and he's put into prison. So the reason that John sends disciples to Jesus in Luke chapter 7 is because he can't go himself. He's in prison. And so what we see here is John asks this very reasonable question. He had some expectations. He's living through an experience that's causing him to question, Jesus, are you what I thought you were? I have an impression of what I think you are. Are you really that? Are you really the Messiah? Are you really the one who's going to rescue us? And Jesus gives a simple response. We see it in verses 21 to 23. First, he responds by simply repeating almost verbatim what he said in Luke chapter 4 when he read from Isaiah chapter 61. He responds by repeating the promises. This is who the Messiah is. This is what it means that God is sending someone to rescue you. And I'm doing all these things. You've seen it and you heard it and you know it's true, John. But then the second thing that Jesus does is he responds with this sort of cryptic phrase. In verse 23, he says, "Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. You see, what Jesus is saying to John is, you've had an impression of me, but John, perhaps your impression is wrong. John, I am who I claim to be. I am the Messiah. I am the one that was promised. But perhaps you've had a wrong impression of me. And Jesus' advice, Jesus' encouragement to John is, don't give up on believing in the gospel just because your first impression of Jesus is not quite accurate. You see, John had an impression based on his expectations, and we also can have expectations of what we expect about Jesus. Perhaps, like John, we think Jesus is too gracious. How could Jesus be good to people who were so evil? Or maybe we think he's too harsh. How could he punish people and allow things to happen that seem quite harsh? Maybe we think Jesus is too inclusive, like the Pharisees did. Why does he welcome these sinners and outcasts? Doesn't Jesus know what kind of people these are? Or maybe we think Jesus is too exclusive. How can he say there's only one way to get to heaven? We all have expectations that we come to our relationship with Jesus is. And Jesus says, I am the one who can rescue you. But perhaps you've brought expectations that have given you a wrong impression. But more potent, I think, actually, is the personal experience, because that's the place where it's not actually theoretical. Sometimes it's coming out of pain. You see, John came to Jesus not only with an expectation, but with an experience. He was preaching the gospel, and he had to stop that because he was put into prison. And really, he was waiting to die, and he would die. And so there's John in prison. Perhaps he's upset because he thinks that Jesus, the Messiah, is going to avenge the fact that the gospel isn't being preached. Jesus, I'm not preaching anymore. Surely you want to come rescue me so I can preach again. But I suspect, like most of us, John is a human being with feelings as well. And there's John saying, Jesus, we're family. I thought you loved me and I'm suffering. Aren't you going to come and stop my suffering? And Jesus says, I'm exactly who I promised to be. I'm exactly what you need to rescue you and to rescue the world. But John, I'm not coming to stop your suffering. Sometimes that is the harder weight to bear. It's the harder impression that we have that following Jesus means somehow we won't have to suffer. And that's why Jesus says, you're blessed if you can continue to have faith and you can continue to follow him, even if you have the wrong impression that he's always going to stop your suffering. So my question for you today is, listening to this, perhaps like John, you feel a bit scandalized by Jesus, scandalized by his graciousness, his inclusiveness, maybe scandalized by the fact that he punishes sin, or that he says there's only one way to heaven. Or maybe you're just scandalized that he doesn't always rescue us from our suffering. My encouragement to you today is if you're grabbing hold of your faith and you're struggling a bit with your first impression of Jesus, perhaps you take him at his word and recognize that he does tell us the truth. He is the Messiah. He has come to rescue us, and to hang on to your faith despite the fact that he does not always prevent our suffering.